boy who would become William the Conqueror was born in 1028, the bastard son of Robert I, Duke of Normandy. Due to their Norse roots, bastard children were less of an embarrassment for Norman rulers, and so Robert legitimised his new son and tutored him to become his heir. William was granted honorary titles to improve his prestige in the eyes of his future vassals, and when Robert left for a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, he called a feast to gather his nobles and have them meet their soon-to-be liege. Of course, Robert I didn't know for sure that he was going to die on his journey, but he did know that RN Jesus is a fickle thing, and so he entrusted the realm to his uncle, Robert of Evero, designating him as regent in his absence. Even so, when Duke Robert died from an illness caught after he stubbornly walked in the rain, his death threw the duchy into chaos. Luckily for young William, who was not yet 10 years old, his great-uncle was a rock in this sea of troubles, almost single-handedly holding off attempted coups and rebellions through sheer force of will. So of course, Robert followed his nephew to the grave just 2 years later, leading to a succession of ambitious and/or incompetent regents scrambling for power through the young William. The Duke of Brittany, Alan V, supposedly claimed that William's father had entrusted the boy to his custody before he left for the pilgrimage. Unsurprisingly, no one believed this obvious lie, but Alan died before he could contest the truth of it. As a side note, you'll notice that Paradox have made his character a hunchback, possibly to emphasise his stereotypically villain status. After the death of Robert, the regent, not the duke, Gilbert of Brion became the chief guardian of the boy ruler, but he was assassinated within a few months of taking power. Another of William's regents took to sleeping in the same room as his charge for security, but even he was murdered, right in front of the sleeping boy. While this murderous game of Pass the Duke was going on, William's vassals were engaged in their own private wars, but none actively opposed the rule of the Duke, such as it was. However, once William came of age and began consolidating control of his realm, his vassals revolted en masse, causing William to flee to his neighbour and liege, the King of France. Despite rulers being unable to join their vassals' wars, Henry I marched his much more numerous forces into the duchy and restored order. William, probably quite happy that this glitch worked in his favour, began revoking the titles of his errant vassals. It didn't take long for the French king to grow wary of his increasingly powerful vassal, to the point that the king attempted to revoke William's titles. This led to a war that William, through his high martial skill, managed to force into a white peace. With this increase in prestige from humbling the monarch, William arranged a marriage between himself and Matilda of Flanders. The marriage was very fruitful, and Matilda bore William around 10 children. Incidentally, Paradox have decided that being 5 foot tall is classed as having dwarfism, so in the game she has the congenital dwarf trait. While the events that would lead to the succession crisis of 1066 occurred in England, William continued to expand his power base in northern France, securing the county of Maine for his eldest son Robert. There are too many Roberts in this. So far we have Great Uncle Robert, Daddy Robert, and now Little Robert. For goodness sake, Normans, be more original with your names, please. Anyway, Little Robert was placed on the throne of Maine in 1064. With his eyes firmly on claiming England, which had supposedly been promised to him by the ageing Edward the Confessor, William looked to further secure his borders. Flanders was allied to him through his marriage to the apparently dwarf Matilda. The south was controlled by the young King Philip, who was in a regency and therefore occupied with that. But his border with Brittany was wide open, and had historically been a thorn in Normandy's side for the entire existence of the duchy. William declared a tributary war against King Conan of Brittany, making sure to siege down every holding he could reach. While gaining him the funds necessary for his invasion of England, it also crippled his potentially opportunistic neighbour, rendering his borders fully secure. In January 1066, Edward the Confessor died. While he made some notable achievements during his reign, history knows him best for the absolute chaos that followed his death, as he had left no children and plenty of powerful claimants. Harald Godwinson, his most powerful vassal, was crowned as his successor, but invasion forces in Normandy and Scandinavia were already gathering to press their respective claims. William had papal sanction to press his claim, and had gathered a significant number of event troops in order to successfully conquer England. And so Harald Godwinson mustered his levies and retinues on the south coast, hoping to engage William's forces as they disembarked and were low on morale. However, William waited before crossing, and the Norwegian claimant, Harald Hardrada, landed in the north, forcing Godwinson to divert his forces to contest them. In the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harald Hardrada was killed and his forces put to flight, and his invasion ended inconclusively. As this was happening, William finally landed in England without any opposition. Harold managed an incredible pace back to the south, and rushed into battle with the Normans at a little-known site called Hastings. And now anyone with even the most basic knowledge of English history knows what happened here. William and Harold battled. William was either genuinely injured or performed a tactical ruse, history is undecided, and his men began to flee, causing the English line to give up their defensive positions and give chase. The Normans then turned around, Harold was killed, and most of his forces were wiped out. Following this victory, possibly the most famous battle in all of English history, William only needed to occupy the holdings of Dover, Canterbury and parts of Kent in order to reach 100% war score. Winning the war replaced his previous title, the Bastard, with his famous nickname the Conqueror, which is very convenient for schoolteachers who now don't have to say bastard multiple times a lesson. William's hold on his new title was far from secure, as Edgar, a relative of Edward the Confessor and King Sven of Denmark, still lived. Edgar was a vassal of William, and obviously was no fan of his new liege due to the numerous opinion penalties, while Sven was also promised the throne of England by Edward. Who didn't he promise it to, seriously? And the Dane had a strong claim of his own. William made the potentially short-sighted choice of granting Edgar, a hostile claimant to his new title, land in the north of England, giving him a power base with which to plot and form a faction for his claim to the throne. When the time came, the brothers Edwin and Morcar, both powerful Anglo-Saxon dukes in the north of England, fired their demands to William. Having fought and plotted for so long to claim the throne, he was not about to give it up, and so he chose not to give in to the blackmail. The rebels were crushed, and William began what was known as the Harrowing of the North, where royal armies burnt and destroyed much of the rebelling land, and Edgar fled to Denmark. Here he found common cause with Sven, who decided to press his new courtier's claim against the fledgling Norman kingdom. His forces landed, but William successfully bought him off with gifts of gold, and Sven promised never to return, which of course he did when another faction attempted to press his claim. Yet again, Scandinavian forces ravaged the English coast, and, yet again, William was able to enforce a white peace with Sven, and the Dane departed. With the most powerful enemies of his reign dealt with, William could focus on his rulership, reforming the ancient laws of England, building new castle holdings throughout his realm, and replacing rebellious Anglo-Saxon vassals with loyal Normans. Most famously, he began a census that would become known as the Domesday Book, but William would die before ever having the chance to make use of it. William the Conqueror's death could not have been more at odds for a man who led such an extraordinary life. His years of rule had led to the warrior king becoming rather obese, and it was during a hunt that the king injured himself on the pommel of his saddle that must have caused internal injuries. He died in ruin, and his body was moved to Caen where he desired to be buried. Also, I apologise for the pronunciation of that, I just can't do it. Due to his girth, William's corpse could not fit into the tomb, and as it was forced inside, the king's cadaver actually burst, covering those nearest in his rotten royal remains, and filling the church with the stench of dead king. As the saying goes, at the end of the game, the king and the pawn go into the same box, but the pawn can usually fit into that box without exploding over those in attendance. The empire that William had forged, that made up the Kingdom of England and a substantial portion of northern France, fractured into civil war between his sons on his death. The House of Normandy continued to rule their holdings for another century, before being usurped by the House of Anjou, who ruled what is known as the Angevin Empire. William the Conqueror's impact on England is still disputed by historians, with some considering him a foreign invader who often cruelly oppressed the native population, which he was, while others see him as the creator of the modern English state, and a herald of an England tied to continental Europe, which he also was. Either way, it's no surprise that his invasion is the original start date for the game. My sources for this video were of course Wikipedia, which is, as always, amazing, but also David Crowther's History of England podcast, which you can find on iTunes, and I heartily recommend it. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking, sharing, commenting, or subscribing, whichever you think it's worth.